the high desert town of Red Willow, where the wind never seemed to rest and dust crept into every crack and corner, people noticed what set you apart long before they ever learned your name. Lila Carter learned that early. At 25, some days felt no different from when she was 10, standing in the schoolyard while boys tugged at her hair and girls laughed behind their hands. Her hair was thick and tightly curled, dark as mesquite bark after rain. It sprang back no matter how often she tried to tame it. The townsfolk called it wild, said it didn't belong on a proper white girl's head. They never said Apache out loud. They didn't need to. Her mother had been Apache, quiet, soft-spoken, with the same curls Lila carried now. She died when Lila was 16, taken by a fever that came through Red Willow one winter without permission. All Lila had left of her was a faded shawl, a small medicine pouch she kept hidden, and that unruly hair everyone seemed to hate. Lila loved it anyway. It was the one part of her mother the world couldn't take. Red Willow was the kind of place where people watched from behind lace curtains and remembered slights longer than kindness. The railroad had passed them by years ago, and what remained was a town living on habit more than hope. Folks needed something or someone to look down on, and Lila made an easy target. She worked where she could, mending, washing, helping in kitchens. When she was allowed, always polite, always quiet, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. On a gray morning in early fall, she stood near the hitching rail outside Mercer's general store, arms wrapped around herself, listening to a group of young men talk louder than they needed to. "Did you hear about Jesse Wilde?" one of them said, spitting into the dirt. "Hard not to," another laughed. "Whole valleys heard about that lunatic. They say he's gone mad since his wife died. Drinks all day, yells at shadows. No one will work for him, not for any money." Lila's stomach tightened. She knew the name. Everyone did. Jesse Wilde owned the horse ranch out past Juniper Ridge, about 3 miles from town. His parents had built it by hand decades earlier, back when Apache families still held some ground without apology. People said the ranch had once been the pride of the valley, strong stock, good breeding horses that sold for more than a man's yearly wages. That had been before tragedy hollowed it out. They said Jesse barely came into town anymore, but his fences leaned, his corrals sat dirty, and his horses went half wild. Complaints had reached Gus Harper, the sheriff. Neighbors muttered about smell and neglect. Someone had finally forced him to post a notice looking for help. Lila hadn't seen the notice herself, but she felt its weight now hanging in the air between cruel smiles. One of the men glanced her way, eyes catching on her hair, a grin spreading across his face. "Well," he drawled, "I reckon we finally found someone brave or foolish enough to take that job." The others followed his gaze. Lila's pulse thudded in her ears. "Hey, Curls," another called. "Why don't you go clean up after the madman?" Laughter rolled through them, sharp and easy. She tried to step away, but one of the women from the boarding house, Tessa Shaw, with her neat braids and sharp eyes, moved to block her path. "You should be grateful, Grace," Tessa said sweetly. "It's honest work. Ain't that what you always say you want?" Lila swallowed. "I didn't say—" She started, but Tessa cut in. "You will," Tessa said, "because if you don't go, we might just decide that hair of yours needs fixing." Her hand lifted, fingers opening and closing like scissors. The threat landed heavier than a slap. Lila's breath came shallow. That hair was more than hair. It was memory. It was the last thing that made her feel connected to someone who had loved her without condition. "I'll go," she said quietly. The laughter faltered, surprised. "Well," one of the men said, "she's serious." They laughed again, louder this time, as if her fear was part of the entertainment. "Good luck," Tessa called after her. "Don't let him scare you too bad." Lila didn't answer. She turned away before they could see the sting in her eyes and walked home with her head down, boots crunching against gravel and dry waste. That night she packed what little she owned, 2 dresses, a shawl, a small bar of soap, and her mother's pouch tucked deep into her bag. She didn't sleep much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw a man with wild eyes and a raised fist, heard stories of shouting and broken things. By dawn, the sky stretched wide and pale over the land. With each step, Lila Carter left Red Willow behind her, the town growing smaller as she walked toward Juniper Ridge. The road was rough and uneven, and the air smelled of sage and dry earth. After 2 miles, her legs ached and dust settled along the hem of her dress. As the ranch finally came into view, her heart raced, not from the long walk but from fear. The place looked worn down. The fences sagged where posts had rotted, and the corral gate hung crooked on a single hinge. Horses scattered across the pasture, some with ribs, showing manes tangled and unkempt. A barn leaned to one side, its red paint faded to the color of old blood. Lila stopped at the edge of the yard, staring at what was meant to be her punishment. As a joke, as a means to put her in her place, she took a steadying breath, smoothed her unruly hair, and let the curls fall where they would. If she was going to be judged, it would be as she was. The front door creaked open, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered. Dark hair pulled back at the nape of his neck. His face was worn, not with age, but with something heavier, grief maybe, or exhaustion that no amount of sleep could heal. He looked younger than the stories suggested, perhaps around 30. His eyes were dark, watchful, like a man used to expecting trouble, and he studied her in silence. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady. Lila's voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "My name is Lida." A quick flick of his gaze took in her hair, then returned to her face. There was no mockery in his eyes, just caution. "They sent you," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Yes. For a moment she thought he might send her away, laugh, shout, or confirm all the ugly things people said about him. Instead he sighed deeply, the sound coming from somewhere deep in his chest. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice heavy. Lila lifted her chin. "If I don't work out," she said carefully, "or if my hair bothers you, you can let me go." He looked at her for a long moment, then spoke softly. "I won't argue you. You can stay." "I'm not like them," he added, meeting her gaze, and for the first time Lila felt a flicker of relief. "While you're here, no one touches you. Not your hair, not anything else." The wind stirred the dust at their feet, and somewhere a horse snorted softly. Lila felt something loosen inside her chest just a little. "All right," she said. With that, she stepped into a life that would change them both, though neither of them knew how just yet. Lila quickly learned that silence could speak louder than any shout. The first morning at the ranch, Jesse Wilde didn't say much. He handed her a broom with a worn handle and nodded toward the barn. That was all. No instructions, no warnings, just a simple gesture as if trusting her to understand what needed doing. The barn smelled of old hay dust and neglect. Manure had hardened into ridges along the stalls, and the water troughs were covered in a thick film of green. Lila tied her shawl around her waist, rolled up her sleeves, and began to work. Outside, Jesse moved through the yard with slow, deliberate steps. He repaired a loose fence rail, then another. His hands were steady, practiced, though his shoulders carried a weight that didn't belong to physical labor alone. Every so often he glanced toward the barn, not to check on her progress, but as if making sure she was still there. By midday, the sun sat high and unforgiving. Lila's back ached and blisters rose on her palms, but she didn't stop. She worked the way she'd learned to survive quietly, thoroughly, without drawing attention. Jesse watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. The town hadn't been kind to him since the day his wife died. She'd been buried on a rise beyond the cottonwoods where the ground stayed soft in spring. After that, people said Jesse changed. He drank too much, raged at the horses, cursed the sky. No one had bothered to ask what grief looked like to an Apache man who had already buried too much of his life. Grief for Jesse had come as silence. He stopped going into town, Let letters pile up unanswered. Let the fences sag and weeds choke the garden. Every sound in the house reminded him of what was gone, the scrape of a chair, the creak of floorboards, the echo of laughter that lived only in memory. The quiet was filled with whispers. By the time Gus Harper came knocking responding to complaints, Jesse Wilde had learned not to care what people called him, mad, savage, dangerous. Words were easy when you didn't have to live with the weight of them. Lila Carter finished the barn before sundown. She stacked hay, neatly scrubbed the troughs until the water ran clear, and swept until the packed dirt floor showed again. When she stepped outside, dust clung to her dress and curls slipped free from the ribbon at the nape of her neck. Jesse stood by the porch watching. "You didn't leave," he said. "No, sir," Lila replied. "You could have." She met his gaze. "I said I'd work." He nodded once. "You can sleep inside tonight." Her eyes widened. "I don't want to trouble you." "You're not," he said shortly. "There's only one bed. You take it. And you, I'll manage." That night, Lila lay awake beneath a thin quilt, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. A floorboard creaked near the kitchen. A chair scraped softly. She imagined Jesse settling near the stove, making do without complaint. It unsettled her more than anger ever would. At dawn, she woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. The kitchen was small but clean, with light filtering through a single window. Jesse sat at the table, a tin cup in his hands. "You cook?" he asked, glancing at the bread she'd begun kneading. "A little," she said, "if that's all right." He hesitated, then nodded. "Use what's there." That became their rhythm. Lila rose early, baked bread, and set a pot of pumpkin soup to simmer when the weather turned cool. She worked through the day, mucking stalls, brushing horses, hauling water in 5-gallon buckets from the well. She learned their names, spoke to them, softly noticing how they calmed beneath her touch. Jesse noticed too. The horses stopped pacing. They ate better. Their coats began to shine again. He showed her how to set a fence post straight, how to spot a sick animal before it showed signs. His voice was low, steady, never raised. When she made a mistake, he corrected her without ridicule. "This isn't what they said you were." Lila blurted it out one evening before she could stop herself. "What did they say? That you were angry, that you were dangerous?" A corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "People talk. They said you were mad." He thought about it. "Maybe I was for a while." She didn't push. She'd learned that silence could be kindness too. Days passed, then weeks. The garden behind the house, long abandoned, began to change under Lila's care. She pulled weeds, turned the soil, and planted seeds salvaged from town. Green, pushed through brown, flowers followed. Sometimes Jesse sat on the steps and watched her work, elbows resting on his knees. She hummed without realizing it, a soft tune her mother used to sing. It stirred something in him, something gentle and sharp all at once. "You're seeing ghosts," he told himself one evening. As the sun bled red along the horizon, Jesse reached for the bottle he kept hidden beneath the sink. His fingers brushed the glass. Lila saw him. She didn't shout, didn't scold. She just set the dish she was drawing down and looked at him. "That won't help," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "You don't know that." "I do," she said. "I've watched it eat people alive." He laughed bitterly. "Everyone thinks they know what's best for me. I'm not everyone." The words hung between them. He sat down heavily at the table, rubbing a hand over his face. The bottle stayed where it was. "My wife used to love this place," he said after a long moment. "Said the land listened if you treated it right." Lila sat across from him. "I think it does." He looked at her, then not as a burden, but as a woman who saw the world in a way that reminded him of what he'd lost. "They're wrong about you," he said. "They're wrong about you too," she replied. Outside, the horses shifted softly in their stalls. The house felt less hollow than it had in years. For the first time since his wife's death, Jesse Wilde slept through the night without reaching for the bottle or the memories it numbed. And in town, though they didn't know it yet, people had begun to notice something strange. The madman's ranch no longer looked like it was dying. By the third week, the ranch no longer felt like a place on the edge of ruin. It wasn't sudden. Nothing truly good ever was. The change came quietly, like dawn breaking over the horizon, slow and almost unnoticed. Then one day you realized the darkness had slipped away. Grace Dunn rose before the first light every morning. The sky was always a pale blue when she stepped outside. The air was cool enough to raise goosebumps along her arms. She loved that hour most, when the land felt honest and unjudging. She carried 2 5-gallon buckets from the well, careful not to spill a drop, filling the troughs before the horses grew restless. They had begun to recognize her footsteps. A few snorted softly when they saw her ears turning forward instead of pinning back like they once had. "You're spoiled already," she told them with a smile, rushing down a gray mare whose ribs no longer showed so sharply. The barn smelled different now. Clean hay, fresh water leather instead of rot. Grace took pride in that. Pride was a quiet thing, but it settled deep. Inside the house, Jesse Wilde listened to the rhythm of her work as he dressed. He heard the creak of the well handle, the low murmur of her voice speaking to the animals, the scrape of boots on packed dirt, sounds of life and purpose. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that. He ate breakfast at the table most mornings now. Grace baked bread every other day, shaping the loaves with practiced hands. She made pumpkin soup when the nights turned colder, stretching it with onions and whatever vegetables the garden could spare. The garden. Jesse still found himself standing at the back door staring at it like a man seeing green for the first time, where weeds once choked the earth. Rows of beans climbed rough wooden stakes. Squash leaves spread wide and confident. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence line, their colors bold against the dust. Grace knelt among them, skirts gathered, curls pinned up loosely, fingers dark with soil. She treated the plants like they mattered. Once Jesse asked, "Why bother with flowers?" Grace didn't look up. "Because the land remembers kindness," she said, "and because beauty is a kind of work too." He had no answer for that. As the ranch improved, so did Jesse. He started riding the perimeter again, checking fence lines, counting stock. He repaired the north corral, replacing boards that had been split for years. When a trader passed through asking about horses, Jesse surprised himself by negotiating instead of waving the man off. By the end of the week, he'd sold 2 young geldings for a fair price. Grace noticed the change in him, the way she noticed everything quietly. "You're smiling more," she said one evening as they ate. He paused, a spoon halfway to his mouth. "Am I?" She nodded just a little. He looked down, embarrassed. "Don't spread it around." She laughed soft and warm, and the sound stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. That night, Jesse took the chair near the stove again, like he always did. The bed was hers. He insisted on it, no matter how often she protested. "You work harder than I do," he told her once. "That earns you a decent place to sleep." But sometimes, lying on the narrow cot with the fire dying low, Grace worried about him. She heard him shifting the slow breath that carried weight behind it. She wondered how long a man could carry grief before it bent him too far. One evening, after a hard day repairing the western fence, Jesse came in smelling faintly of whiskey. Grace noticed immediately, but she didn't say anything at first. She served supper, watching him eat in silence. When he reached for the bottle again, she laid her hand gently over his. "Please don't," she said. He stiffened. "You don't get to tell me what." "I know," she interrupted, her voice steady. "I'm not trying to control you." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm asking you to stay," she said. "Right here with me, not in the past." The words cut deeper than anger ever could. He stared at her hand on his small but firm. Slowly he set the bottle down. "My wife used to sit where you're sitting," he said quietly. "She loved the mornings." Grace listened, her hand unmoving. "She said the sun over Juniper Ridge was proof the world still wanted us." And when she died, he continued, everything went quiet. I thought if I stayed angry, I wouldn't have to feel how empty it was. Grace swallowed. My mother used to say, pain doesn't leave just because you shut the door. It waits. He looked at her, then really looked at her. Curls escaping their pins, the honesty in her eyes. You talk like someone twice your age, he said. She smiled sadly. Life sometimes teaches its lessons early. They sat together long after the fire had burned low, speaking in hushed tones about lost memory and the strange ways people survive what should have broken them. From that night on, Jessie Wilde touched the bottle less and less. Work filled the hours where grief once lived. Purpose crowded out regret. The horses grew stronger. Buyers came back. Word began to spread that Jessie's stock was worth looking at again. Lila Carter helped keep the book's neat rows of numbers penciled carefully onto ledger paper. She had a knack for order that Jessie lacked, and he trusted her with it without hesitation. You're part of this, he told her once. You should know how it runs. The words warmed her more than any praise ever could. In town, the Red Willow folk began to notice. They whispered when Jessie came into town. Taller now, steadier. They noticed the woman beside him, curls unhidden, back straight. Some scoffed. Others frowned. She won't last, someone muttered. He'll turn on her, another predicted. But weeks passed. Then more. Lila didn't leave. Instead, the ranch began to breathe again. One late afternoon, Jessie watched from the porch as Lila watered the garden. She paused, resting her hands on her hips, surveying her work with quiet satisfaction. For the first time since his wife's death, Jessie felt something loosen in his chest that wasn't pain. Hope, he realized, was not loud. It was the sound of water soaking into dry ground. Autumn settled over Juniper Ridge the way it always did, quiet at first, then all at once. Nights grew sharp with cold, and the wind carried the smell of frost down from the higher ground. Lila pulled her shawl tighter when she stepped outside in the mornings, her breath turning white as she crossed the yard. Jessie noticed things like that now. He noticed when her hands grew red from the cold and left a pair of gloves on the kitchen table without comment. He noticed when she favored her left shoulder, after a long day hauling feed, and quietly took over the heavier work the next morning. He noticed because he was paying attention again, and attention had a way of bringing the past closer than a man sometimes wanted. The garden was nearly done for the season. Squash lay heavy on the vines, pumpkins round and bright against the dark soil. Lila knelt to cut the last of the herbs, tying them in bundles to dry near the stove. My wife used to plant sage, Jessie said suddenly. Lila looked up, startled by the sound of his voice breaking the silence. He stood a few feet away, hands shoved into his coat pockets. She said it kept bad dreams away. Lila nodded slowly. My mother believed the same. They shared a quiet smile, the kind that comes from knowing something without having to explain it. That night after supper, the wind rose hard and restless. It rattled the windows and pushed smoke back down the chimney. Jessie added another log to the stove and sat heavily in the chair across from Lila. He reached for the bottle again. Lila felt her chest tighten. She didn't stop him this time, not right away. She waited until he poured a finger of whiskey into his cup, then spoke, her voice calm but firm. Noah, she said, tell me about her. His hand froze. Tell you what, he asked, though. He knew exactly what she meant. About your wife, Lila said, not how she died, but who she was. The cup trembled slightly as he set it down. She laughed at everything he said after a long moment. Even me, especially me. She said I took life too seriously. A faint smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. She loved horses that other folks said were too stubborn, said they just needed patience. Lila listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. When she got sick, he continued, I thought I could fix it. Thought work would keep it away. But death doesn't care how hard you labor. Silence settled between them. thick but not uncomfortable. I started drinking after he admitted, not because it hurt less, but because it helped me feel nothing at all. Lila stood and crossed the room, placing a gentle hand over his. Feeling nothing isn't the same as healing. He looked up at her eyes, dark and tired. And what would you know about healing? He asked. She hesitated, then reached up and loosened the ribbon, holding her hair back. The curls spilled free around her shoulders, wild and unapologetic. My mother used to brush my hair every night, she said softly. Said it was a gift from her people. When she died, everyone told me to cut it. Said it made me look strange. It wasn't something that could be easily accepted. Jessie Wilde remained silent, watching her. Lila Carter thought about it, but she didn't speak right away. I thought about it, she said softly, her voice low. It would have made my life easier. She continued, swallowing hard, but then she added, but it would have been like losing her twice. Tears stung her eyes, but she kept them from falling. I've learned something, she said quietly. Pain doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means you love deeply. Jesse's chest tightened. He'd spent so long believing his grief was a weakness, a flaw that made him unworthy of the world. You make it sound simple, he said. It isn't, Lila replied, but it's honest. Jesse pushed the cup away untouched. That night, for the first time in a long while, Jesse didn't reach for the bottle. The next few weeks brought change, steady, undeniable. Jesse rose earlier, rode farther, spent more time with the horses. He started keeping proper records again, tallying feed costs and breeding schedules. Lila helped where she could, her handwriting neat and precise. They worked side by side, comfortable in silence, finding an ease neither of them expected. But the town was watching. When Jesse rode into town to sell a mare that fetched nearly $800, men gathered at the edge of the street, pretending not to stare. When Lila walked beside him, her curls uncovered, heads turned. Looks like the madman's found himself a miracle, one muttered. Others weren't so kind. They whispered about how quickly the ranch was turning around and how an Apache man and a white girl with wild hair couldn't possibly be doing honest business. Envy replaced ridicule, and Lila felt it every time they passed. The looks, the low murmurs. One afternoon, as they stood near the feed store, a group of women began whispering loudly enough for her to hear. Guess all it takes is letting a savage run wild, one said. And a girl who doesn't know her place, another added. Lila's chest tightened. She turned away, tears blurring her vision, and walked quickly toward the hitching rail. Jesse heard it. He turned slowly, his posture straightening, drawing attention without effort. That's enough, he said, his voice low but caring. The women fell silent. He stepped forward. You don't know her. He continued, his words sharp. And you don't know me, so keep our names out of your mouths. No one responded. Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding. That evening back at the ranch, she finally broke. I don't want to be the reason they hate you more, she said. They're living free. Maybe I should. Jesse cut her off gently. No. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. You're not the reason, he said, his voice firm. Their fear is. Lila searched his face, her brow furrowing. Why do you protect me? She asked quietly. Jesse thought for a moment, then answered. Because someone should have protected you a long time ago. The truth of it settled between them, heavy and undeniable. That night, the wind died down. The ranch lay quiet under a sky full of stars. Jesse stood at the door, looking out over land that felt alive again. For the first time, he understood something his wife had once said: love didn't erase grief. It taught you how to carry it without letting it own you. Success has a way of changing how people look at you. By late fall, the Black Horse Ranch no longer sat on the edge of ruin. The fences were straight. The corrals were clean. The horses moved with a calm strength that buyers noticed the moment they stepped onto the land. Words spread first in hushed voices, then louder, carried on the same wind that once hauled only dust. Jesse sold 6 horses before the first snow. Good animals, well-trained, fetching prices he hadn't seen in years. One buyer from as far as 60 miles north paid nearly $1,000 for a bay mare with steady eyes and strong legs. "You're back in the game," the man had said, shaking Jesse's hand. Lila stood nearby, the ledger tucked against her chest, her cheeks flushed with pride. She hadn't said much, but her eyes shone. She knew every number in that book, every hour of labor that had gone into earning it. Back in town, people noticed the change and they didn't like it. The same mouths that once laughed now whispered. The same eyes that dismissed now narrowed with suspicion. "Too fast," someone said outside the saloon. "No way, that's clean," another replied. "Apache man and a girl like that." Something wasn't right. Lila Carter felt the change before Jesse Wilde did. It happened the day they walked down Main Street together. Lila's arm looped through his as they passed the general store. She heard the sudden hush, the way conversation stopped just long enough to sting. A man spat into the dirt near their feet. "Didn't know madness paid so well," he muttered. Lila's grip tightened on Jesse's sleeve. Her face burned. She lowered her head, letting her curls fall forward, like a shield she'd used all her life. "Don't," Jesse murmured, feeling the shift. "Keep walking." But the looks followed them. At the dry goods store, the clerk hesitated before taking their money. Outside the church, a group of women fell silent as Lila passed, their eyes sharp with judgment. That night, Lila cried for the first time since arriving at the ranch. She sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold it in. Jesse heard it anyway. He stood in the doorway, helpless for a moment. He'd faced down men with knives and guns before. He'd buried his wife with his own hands. But tears left him unsure where to stand. "I thought I was stronger than this," Lila said, wiping her face. "I thought I'd learned how not to care." He sat beside her, his voice soft. "Caring doesn't mean you're weak. They look at me like I don't belong anywhere," she whispered. "Like I never will." Jesse's jaw tightened. He thought about the years he spent carrying that same feeling, wearing it like a second skin. "They don't get to decide that," he said firmly. The next time it happened, he made sure they all heard him. It was a Saturday morning, the busiest day in town. Jesse and Lila stood near the hitching rail when a group of men began laughing openly. "Hey, Black Horse," one called. "Heard you found yourself a good luck charm," another snorted. "Or maybe she's got better tricks than sweeping and cooking." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Lila froze. Her hands flew up to her face, curls hiding her tears as she turned away. Jesse stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "Enough," he said. The word cracked like a whip. The men fell quiet, surprised. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his voice steady and clear. "You think my success comes from cheating, from her?" He gestured toward Lila, still trembling behind him. "That says more about you than it does about us." One man scoffed. "Come on. Look at her." Jesse turned fully, then his anger sharp but controlled. "I am looking at her," he said. "I see a woman who works harder than anyone here. A woman who brought life back to land, to a place you all wrote off as dead." Silence spread outward, thick and uncomfortable. Jesse continued, his voice louder now. "You call her hair ugly. I call it beautiful. You call her strange. I call her kind. What's ugly is a town that can't stand to see two people rise without trying to drag them back down." Lila lowered her hands slowly, disbelief written across her face. Jesse turned to her, his voice softening, but still caring. "Lila," he said, "you are not something to be ashamed of." He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing the small velvet box he'd carried for weeks, waiting for courage to catch up to intention. "I should have said this sooner," he went on, "but I won't wait anymore." He dropped to one knee in the dirt of Main Street. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Not because it'll silence them, but because I love you. Because this life we've built is real and I want to protect it. With you." Time seemed to stop. Lila stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Tears streamed down her face, but she smiled. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, stronger, "Yes." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone clapped slowly, hesitantly. Another joined in. Then another. The sound grew until it filled the street, applause breaking through years of cruelty and silence. Some looked ashamed. Others looked thoughtful. A few still looked bitter, but their voices were gone. Jesse rose, pulling Lila into his arms. She clung to him, trembling but standing tall. That night back at the ranch, the stars burned bright against the cold sky. Grace Dunn rested her head against Jesse Wilde's shoulder on the porch, listening to the horses shift in their stalls. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice soft. "So was I," he replied. "But some things are worth facing a whole town for." She smiled up at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said quietly. And for the first time in her life, Grace truly believed that she belonged exactly where she stood. Winter came early that year, slipping down from the mountains with little warning. Frost glazed the ground by mid-November, and the creek along Juniper Ridge ran thin and sharp beneath the skin of ice. The ranch settled into a quieter rhythm, shaped by shorter days and longer nights. Grace adapted easily. She learned how to bank the stove so the fire lasted through the night. She patched quilts by lamplight and hung herbs from the rafters to dry. The house, once hollow and echoing, now carried warmth in its corners, soft laughter, the scrape of chairs, and the steady comfort of shared meals. Jesse watched it all with a kind of wonder he never spoke aloud. The wedding was simple, just as Grace wanted. They stood in the small church at the edge of town. Its white paint was chipped and its pews worn smooth by generations of elbows and prayers. Snow dusted the steps outside, and the bell rang once clear and bright. People came quietly at first, a few neighbors, the store clerk, the horse trader who'd done business fairly. Then more followed. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt, a few out of genuine happiness. Grace wore a modest cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself. Her curls were pinned back loosely, just enough to keep them from her face. But she didn't hide them. She never would again. When Jesse took her hands, his grip was steady. "I don't promise easy days," he said, his voice low but sure. "But I promise honesty, protection, and a home." Grace smiled through tears. "I don't promise perfection," she replied, "but I promise to stay to work and to love you as you are." The minister spoke the words. Jesse slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his hands rough and warm. When they kissed, the church filled with quiet applause, not loud, not showy, but sincere. Outside, snow began to fall. Married life didn't change their days as much as it changed them. Grace moved fully into the house, though little else shifted. She still rose early, still tended the horses and the garden when the weather allowed. Jesse still worked the land with care and patience. But now there were small touches, a hand at her back as she passed, a shared glance across the table that spoke of something settled and strong. The town adjusted slowly. People nodded instead of staring. Some offered apologies in awkward half-sentences. Others brought small gifts, bread preserves, a knitted blanket left quietly on the porch. Not everyone changed, but enough did. On Christmas Eve, the sky hung low and heavy with snow. Grace had been tired all day, more than usual, and by nightfall the pains came sharp and steady. Jesse didn't panic, though fear clawed at his chest. He wrapped her in blankets, saddled the horse, then stopped, realizing there was no time. The baby was coming, whether he was ready or not. Grace gripped his hand, breathing through the pain, her face pale but determined. "You're doing fine," he told her, his voice steady, even as his heart raced. "You're stronger than this." She laughed weakly. "You always say that." "'Cause it's true." Hours passed, marked by the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the fire. When the baby finally arrived, his cry cut through the night, strong and instant alive. A son. Jesse held the child with trembling hands, awe washing over him like something holy. The boy's skin was warm, his fists clenched tight as if already ready to face the world. Grace watched them, tears slipping down her temples. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He is," Jesse said, his voice breaking. "Just like you." They named him Samuel after Jesse's father, a man who had taught him that land and family were worth standing for, even when the world said otherwise. By morning, Christmas Day dawned clear and bright. Snow lay thick across the ranch, untouched and clean. The horses stood quietly in their stalls, steam rising from their backs. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady and sure. Jesse Wilde stood at the window holding his son, watching the sun crest over Juniper Ridge. For years he'd thought happiness was something long lost to him, buried deep alongside grief and memory. But he was wrong. It hadn't been lost. It had been waiting. Grace Dunn rested in bed, her curls spread across the pillow, her face peaceful, lost in sleep. Jesse looked at her, and a gratitude so deep washed over him, it left him breathless. She had come to him as a joke, as something doomed to fail. But instead, she had brought life back to his land and to him. Later that day, neighbors came with food and quiet congratulations. The church bell rang once more, and laughter drifted across the snow, carried by the cold air. Grace stood by the window that evening, Samuel bundled in her arms, watching Jesse walk the fence line one last time before nightfall. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't come here?" Jesse asked when he returned. She smiled softly. "Sometimes, and I think," she said, "that some things grow best in places others have given up on." Jesse reached for her hand, their fingers lacing together easily. Outside, the land lay still beneath the stars. Inside, the house was full, and in a world that had once laughed at them, both Grace and Jesse. Wilde had built something that would endure, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. What was meant to bloom always finds a way. Thank you for spending this time with Grace and Jesse, walking their journey of courage, love, and belonging. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can continue creating even more meaningful stories for you. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you in the next story. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and a respect for original creative work,